People come up to me on a night out and say, "Oh my god, I listened to your podcast. I used to eat my lunch under the stairs by myself. Concealment killed more dreams than inability ever did." I felt like I had won the lottery, like I was going to Disneyland or something. Like I was so grateful. Gratitude journaling probably saved my life at one point. Long-term planning is overrated. If I'm pogo sticking down the street, someone's going to film that somewhere. I now have an audit trail for the last 2 years of every idea I've ever had. And she was like a sweet old grandma. She really, really cared. I can say I'm the best podcaster in Prestwick because I'm the only one. I'm just so grateful for the opportunities that I have had. I feel like a moral responsibility to pass that on to others.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Extrospective podcast. My name is Zach Villeneuve-Snell, and today I'm joined by David Mcintosh, who is a management consultant and co-chair of the UK Social Mobility Network at KPMG, the host of the Development by David podcast, and recently named in Business Insider's 35 Under 35. Thank you for coming on, David.
Thank you, Zach. It's been an absolute delight to be invited on this. I love what the podcast is about. I love that you've started this. The journey already seems so rewarding for you, and it's a privilege to share this evening with you. And like I said, I'm really delighted that you asked me on. And what an intro, by the way. It makes me feel like an imposter when I hear that back. So thank you for showcasing that. It means the world.
No worries. And I mentioned just before we started recording, but for some reason this is the most nervous I've been before recording, and I think that is in part due to the fact that you're one of my primary inspirations for setting up the podcast, and 2 years in and you've got so many amazing guests and your skill is being further and further refined, and so it really is a privilege to have you on, so I can't wait to have this conversation.
And seeing the trajectory that you've already embarked on with your initial panel of episodes, I have no doubt that you'll go on to have the same effect on others. And hopefully at some point, one of those people that you do inspire will reach out and give you that instant feedback. Look, because you've already inspired me as someone that's been on this journey already. So I'm excited for you to pay that forward too.
I've introduced you, but would you like to introduce yourself and who you are today in your own terms?
In my own terms, okay. It's so easy for me to just spitball back the exact intro that you gave me. But that's what I am, not who I am. I'd say I'm a curator of ideas, a purveyor of lessons. I'm a failure and a feedback loop. I'm a servant to society in some way. I guess all of this is underpinned by my North Star, and that's to do good for others. And the easiest way I could have done that is to contribute to the world of social mobility, because the world of social mobility contributed to my own journey. So, like you said, I founded and chair KPMG Social Mobility Network. I have a podcast that is very threaded and embedded into that same North Star. The podcast's aim is to inspire disadvantaged or less privileged young people through Genesis stories. Being a management consultant requires being a change maker, being someone that wants to leave something into existence that hasn't already existed or improve something for someone else. So I think there's a golden thread of doing good for others, and I think that's the legacy that I want to create. So hopefully those three factors of my identity or the three factors of what I am enables me to be who I am. Zach.
For context, as I've done with all the other episodes, and as people are probably fed up with me for repeating the same phrase, but if we turn back the pages and go back to a young David, born on the west coast of Scotland, what's it like growing up there?
It's really easy for me to go into the nitty-gritty of things and start this conversation about talking about the hardships that I've endured. But I must say, the west coast of Scotland is a beautiful place to live. It's rural, the views are amazing. I had instant access to a beach and greenery every single day. But in the neighbouring town, so I live in a town called Prestwick, which is notably known for the home of open golf. It has an airport that's famous because Elvis once refueled his airplane here, and the town's never let go of that legacy. But in the neighbouring town, was my dad's origin. Oh, that's where my dad's origin once started. And I guess the theme of this podcast might bleed into talking about privilege or talking about class or talking about socioeconomic background. But when I use the term disadvantage, I reflect on his story because I've had 10x the advantages that he's had. He grew up in a place called Kilmarnock, which was once popularised by the BBC in their documentary called The Scheme. That showcased, it was essentially a poverty safari that showed drug misuse, violence, poverty in that one town. He grew up with five siblings. All six of them slept in the same bed. They didn't have a duvet. They wore workwear jackets to keep them warm. He had a milk run and a paper run from the ages of 8 to 14, where you would give all the earnings back to his parents. Yeah, it was just classic working class 50s and 60s. My mum experienced a very similar upbringing. Five siblings. I think my grandfather was a window cleaner. My grandmother was unemployed, and they went through very similar times. So I grew up in the west coast of Scotland, and from a young age, I never felt less privileged because I was always reminded of their story. And the first time that was aware that I was a little bit different in that aspect was in school. I realized that, oh, it's not normal to wear the same shoes every single year or have the same rucksack every single year. I learned a lot about your signaling at that point. You would signal your popularity at school by the brands that you would wear or brands that you would eat. I vividly remember asking my parents to buy Walker's crisps in school instead of like Asda Maze pick and mix crisps or like, do you know, like the onion rings and the salt and vinegar sticks. I remember begging them not to buy that because I couldn't signal that everything was okay at school if I took those crisps to school. I wanted to fit in by having Walkers. So I guess growing up in the west coast of Scotland, beautiful, beautiful place. I didn't realize my less privilege until school. But if I wasn't exposed to that environment, I'd have felt privileged based on the anecdotes and the stories that my parents told me. Does that take it back? Does that describe my kind of initial scenario well enough, or do you want me to kind of run through the whole Genesis story? Because I
No,
can go on.
no. I mean that sums it up for me insofar as you're in a bubble of gratitude because you're able to place yourself against those that have come before you and realize how much they've had to work hard to establish the privilege relative to them that you were able to access. But as everything's speeding up and as everyone's rapidly getting more privileged, globalization is happening, and as you say, you go to school and you realize there's even more different levels of privilege. And I can't imagine how it would be like negotiating that as such a young person, where you're immensely grateful for all of these blessings, like a roof over your head and food on the table, but suddenly you're almost convinced that you need to have even more extravagant and decadent things just to fit in. Like, what were your social circles like at that age when you were feeling like you needed to fit in with these things?
It's such a great question. It's something I reflect quite heavily upon. This idea of a gratitude complex, because I've carried my experiences from schooling into the workplace. So one thing that I was told as a young person, whether that was directly from my parents or observantly from watching our environment, was not to disrupt. That disruption was a bad thing. Because how could I disrupt at home when my parents were going through crippling financial difficulties? How could I ask to go to the cinema at the weekend knowing that they didn't have money to spare? That would create a hairline fracture in the vase that they glued together, which was our financial dynamic or our household dynamic. So I was told to be careful and not to disrupt. So I remember going into secondary school, hiding my identity because I didn't want to disrupt. I remember I had one friend who moved to the same secondary school as me, and he went off and met new friends and broadened his friendship group. And he asked me to join him, and I said no because I was too ashamed of my background. I was too scared to get caught out, and that's when I first started really concealing who I was. And in fact, it's funny to laugh at. So I almost pity at it. I used to eat my lunch under the stairs by myself. I was so introverted at the time. I felt like someone from my background had to be introverted because how dare I be extroverted and show all those hairline fractures of my household dynamic in front of the whole cohort. And I think both having a gratitude complex of appreciating everything I'm given and not asking for more, the inability to disrupt, and the appetite to conceal, those three things have stayed with me until I've been able to post rationalize them. So, long story short, Zach, I really struggled to integrate at that age, and perhaps that was a self-limiting belief. Perhaps that was imposed by myself. Perhaps if I did showcase what makes me me to my classmates and the wider cohort, I would have been accepted and had friends. But for some reason, whether it's through movies, through what I've seen on the streets at home, I felt like someone like me couldn't expose those parts. And unfortunately, I paid the social implications of that.
I think many of us can remember back to a time where we find ourselves in school, maybe not vividly, and you kind of look back and you remember there was a cool group, and then there was that really shy person that was really creative. Then there was just that conscientious person that just got on with their work. And that kind of speaks to the emerging temperaments that children start to sort of divert in these dimensions as they sort of navigate through life. Purely speaking, from a temperamental perspective, in terms of if you're like really agreeable or disagreeable or hardworking, how would you describe yourself in that sense?
It goes twofold. I think there was a point where I consumed or identified completely with nihilism. I thought my path was completely out of my hands, and someone like me from my background fell into the circle of life that their parents did, and I had no control over my outcomes. So I didn't try hard. I didn't look for extracurricular opportunities. I accepted the hands of cards that I was given by life and didn't check to see if there was an ace in the pack. And then when I got access to opportunity for the first time, and that was work experience at KPMG through the Social Mobility Foundation in 2015, at the age of 16, I realised that someone from my background could access and progress to an organisation like that. I realised that I had control and could have control and became a very diligent, perhaps disagreeable person because I became tenacious. I became the opposite of what I was before. I was so steadfast in gaining access to opportunity that I would say I would do whatever it would take to get me there. And there's during that period, I went from someone who would wear hoodies and baggy clothes to school that would almost hide me, and would have long hair as well, and I was a little bit overweight. And when I went on that work experience during the summer, I hit the gym. I I shaved my hair. I got a kind of clean cut haircut, and I went back to school with a briefcase and a blazer and a tie on for the first time. I took personal responsibility for the first time because I realized that I could. I guess that was a very long-winded way to answer that question, wasn't it, Zach?
No,
You think as a podcast host, I'd have a more succinct answer, but no, I don't.
uh, I want to kind of hone in on the moment where that flipped for you. You said it was twofold in terms of that realization and adopting responsibility and suddenly coming back to school with a suit on. Firstly, there's another question that's kind of popped into my mind of like, what did your friends think of that? Like, who is this new David who's arrived? But secondly, also, what was it that sparked that change? And why do you think it wasn't sparked earlier on?
When I define social mobility, I think the official definition on the dictionary.com website is the movement of people between social strata, essentially. But the way I would define it, the David McIntosh definition of social mobility is the amount of ease or friction between an individual and their access and awareness to opportunity. So for me, what turned that switch, or what turned off the previous switch that I had in my source code, was that I was able to see people much like me in positions that I wanted to be in. I never had any role models growing up. And if I did, they were blue collar workers or my dad, who was a veteran, two fields in which I never wanted to excel in. But the fact that I could go to London and see people with a Scottish accent or hear people with a Scottish accent who came from a working class background, or see females from Southeast Asia, or see guys from Eastern Europe, like a whole panel of different nationalities, backgrounds, gender, sexualities, abilities. That made me realize that it gave me a directory of role models for the first time. And there was another pivotal point where I I used to bake and sell tablet, which is a Scottish kind of Scottish delicacy. It's a little dessert type treat that we have here in Scotland. I used to sell them round my local house, singing estate, the kind of the same age as that. And my uncle said to me, David, you're good at counting that revenue. You're good at counting that change. You could be an accountant. They make a lot of money. And that was awareness of an opportunity. I knew what an accountant was now, or at least knew it existed. So it gave me something to point and aim at as well. But previously to that, when I turned up to school in complete nihilism, I only knew what a veteran was, or someone that served in the military. I only knew what a joiner, bricklayer, and plumber were because my cousins did that. But now someone told me what an accountant was, so it gave me something to point and aim at, and I think that's really important.
I think it's interesting. I've just had a realization when you're saying that is that when you're a child, you're always asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And the kids will recall, "I want to be a fireman. I want to be a doctor." You know, all these kind of cliched, very important roles. So I suppose a lot of the problem then is not showing kids, especially in. Would you say you were in a rural community?
Yep.
So you're away from the big buzz in the cities. You don't get that exposure, and then yeah, it kind of definitely stresses that importance of if you can see it, then you can be it, and that's definitely a lesson that I've picked up over a few of these conversations now with various individuals that really is important. And I have to admit that's not something I ever really considered myself, and I'm very privileged, I suppose, to have come to that conclusion.
I think we both are in that aspect, and what it takes, and it's the reason why my podcast exists. Is it takes people. Again, I spoke about how I have this quote that concealment killed more dreams than inability ever did. And I really think that's true because it takes just one brave person to share that they came from a lower socioeconomic background to inspire a generation. When I first heard of an accountant and started Googling that term, at least I had something to point and aim at, but when I Googled it, Google Images would return a picture of a white, middle class, middle aged man in a suit. And I thought, well, I'm a man, I'm white, but I'm none of the other characteristics. But it takes another accountant who isn't that archetype to share their story and share their journey to make it more relatable for someone like me. And hopefully, someone in all these different archetypal professions are able to debunk the archetypes that we mentally envisage. Um, Again, to make these careers seem more accessible to a wider range of backgrounds. Because I'm sure the listeners can think, if I say, what does a nurse look like? You'll probably think of a woman. Or if I say, think of what a bricklayer looks like, you'll probably think of a man, right? And I guess if you were to look at the statistics, they probably differ or sway one way or the other, but it's not the entire population. Um, not the entire population of nurses are female, not the entire population of tradespeople are men. So it takes people to conceal their identity for those careers to seem more accessible to someone like me or to other people.
Makes perfect sense. And just to go back on the question I asked, what did your friends think about when you suddenly had this change and you cut your hair off and you were wearing a suit?
I'm not sure if it's the same where you are, but in rural west coast of Scotland, if you are not a white football playing fit straight boy who supports either Celtic or Rangers, you are immediately outcasted. If you are doing something like a podcast or something creative, you are immediately lambasted for it. There's a huge sense of conformity, or there was a huge sense of conformity in my social circle or wider social circle. And people immediately met this new change with vitriol, as if I thought I was better than them, as if I don't know if it's an evolutionary psychology thing where if you change your persona, you're kicked out of the tribe. You're a danger to the tribe. I don't know what it is. But immediately, if you're not conforming to a group, then you're immediately lambasted, and I felt that way. I really did. But again, going to concealment, that point on concealment, I wasn't concealing any longer. I found an identity and I embraced it, and I cashed in on what made me me, and I then reaped the rewards for it. And that same peer group are still hanging about in the same bars in the same town, doing relatively the same things as each other. And maybe they're happy, but I'm also happy because I'm really comfortable in this new identity that I found at that age.
Kind of thinking about where you're at that point and you've re-established yourself. What does the journey look like initially speaking, heading into the professional workplace as someone who doesn't know anyone within 50 miles of where you're from that does that?
It feels euphoric in a way. And maybe that's just the way I'm wired. Maybe similar people who have been on similar journeys felt the opposite. They felt disempowered. They felt like an imposter. But for me, and it's maybe because I am a toxic optimist at times, that I felt euphoric because I did have imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome. Yes, I felt like I didn't belong there, but that's what made that feeling great. I would listen to the same songs that I would once listen to walking. So I would listen to the same songs I listened to in my work experience when walking into the office, and I just felt empowered, not disabled. I felt perhaps this is a new frontier. This is something. I always talk about imposter syndrome, and when it shows up, you should say thank you because it's a reminder that you're creating something into existence that doesn't already exist. And perhaps at that time, and I'm only post rationalizing now, is that I knew I didn't fit in, and that's what made it great. That's what made this challenge exciting, because I had busted into a realm that was once so protected by a single archetype. Um, and I remember feeling that sense of gratitude on the very first day of walking into a big shiny office, being grateful that I had instant access to an opportunity like that. But I can imagine some people are crippled by that feeling of not belonging. Um, because in fact, we're all imposters of each other. If you think about it, only you have lived the unique life experience that you have. Only you can bring that to the table. No one else can do that. So we're all imposters. Um, and I think I was able to recognize that really early on. So it didn't hold me back. It didn't hold me back. But you do see in the office, especially within professional services, there is the concept of culture capital. It's the tastes and traits that you can cash in for reward. And in these professional services firms, or in financial services, or in kind of these kind of institutions, there'll be certain tastes and traits that get you ahead, like bonding over ski holidays or fine wines or what private school you went to. You see a lot of people bonding over these things that I can't relate to. So perhaps that same feeling that I once felt in school about not fitting in, maybe I had that when I first started in professional services because I couldn't relate to the tastes and traits that my peers had. But fortunately enough, I didn't eat lunch under the stairs this time.
Yeah, I think as you uh, as you grow in confidence as well, and as you're establishing your identity, you maybe even encourage others to come and join your tribe, right? And they want to understand more about what you're about and partake in your things. Not that you're making it cool in particular, but you're bringing new ideas and a fresh perspective to life. And I think that's what's so rich about having that culture. I realize we haven't like actually touched on how you actually got this opportunity. Could you potentially briefly explain for the listeners how that came about?
Okay, definitely. I would love to sing the Social Mobility Foundation's praises. They are an organisation that aims to make a practical improvement in the lives of disadvantaged or less privileged young people by giving them access to a panel of support. That could be one-to-one mentoring, it could be work experience programs, it could be CV writing workshops, it could be interview prep. It's basically a cohort of 1,000 less privileged students between the ages of 16 and 17 in the UK. For me, um, I came across them as a teenager because a gentleman in the year above me, or at the time a pupil in the year above me, told me that he received free school meals, and he knew that I did too, and that was the entry requirements for their support. So he sent me the link. I signed up, and lo and behold, they had kind of accountancy work experience discovery week, and that was at KPMG. I knew what an accountant was after my uncle told me that I could apparently be one. I married the two dots, applied, and yeah, they took me to London, where I got to meet loads of different young professionals from a wide range of backgrounds, learn how to network, understand what an auditor was, what a tax advisor was, what a management consultant was. I didn't realize there was so many layers of professional services within a place like KPMG. I just thought an accountant was someone that did a tax return once a year and that was it. Um, so that was a really great eye opener for me. And yeah, it opened my ideas to my idea to start an apprenticeship program. I thought to be an accountant you'd have to go to university. I thought an apprentice was again a blue collar worker or an engineer. I didn't realize that you could be an accounting apprentice. And because I learned that I could earn and learn at the same time, I bypassed the thought of going to university, and through the Social Mobility Foundation support, I applied for apprenticeship program at KPMG, and that's really where my career began.
So university wasn't even a thought for you.
No, it wasn't. I mean, I did apply as a kind of backup option, but it was nothing but a backup option in case it fell through. I guess because I seen what power money had over our family, for better or for worse. I realized how much winning. I remember we won the lottery one year at Christmas, and we got like five numbers up, which usually equate to hundreds of thousands of pounds. But my mum and dad put on really common numbers, and they got like £1,000 or £800. But that was like that should have been like winning £200,000 to them because it paid off their credit card debt and it allowed us to have a Christmas present that year. So I was so hypersensitized to the power of money and recurring revenue or an income. Um, so as soon as I learned that I could be an apprentice and I could have security, something that I never had previously in my life, yeah, I applied for an apprenticeship program because of that sole factor. I think it's useful to add another layer to the stories. So when I applied for my apprenticeship program, I was given an opportunity to join on their Edinburgh office. That's on the very east coast of Scotland. I live in a town called Prestwick on the very west coast of Scotland, so the commute wasn't possible every single day. I would have had to relocate to Edinburgh. Again, going back to that point about concealment, I couldn't afford to move to Edinburgh. I couldn't afford a deposit for a month's rent. I couldn't afford new suits all at the same time, plus a month's living expenses before I got my first wage. But I concealed that. I didn't share that with KPMG. And maybe if I did, they would have paid some of those costs for me to enable me to start. I was so ashamed that I couldn't afford to start that I said to KPMG that I was going through personal circumstances and would like to join 1 year later in our Glasgow office so I could make the commute every single day. So I postponed my offer for an entire year and joined an accounting firm locally. And it was one of these traditional family accountancy firms where everyone but me were related was related. And it was very dogmatic, it was very old school. They would swear and shout at each other. It was so unprofessional. I would have to call the boss by his surname. I would have to wash his plates in the evening. I would have to hand him a snack and mugs of coffee at a break time. I actually remember one story where I brought in my own birthday cake on my birthday, and when I passed him his can of juice, his cup of tea, and his biscuit at break time, he asked me, David, is there still cake there? I replied, yes, Mr. Bell. He replied, you know what to do. So that was my initial experience in accounting in an office environment. But what I did, despite having those challenges, I did learn how to write an email, how to dress in an office, how to communicate with a client, how to serve admin duties. I knew a lot of the accounting processes and procedures. I knew a lot of the terminology, and that really gave me a leg up, Zach, when I joined KPMG. It really, really did. I watched myself excel at a rapid pace because I didn't have to learn how to work Outlook or how to do certain functions on Excel. But that was just by my previous access and awareness to opportunity. I realized that perhaps those from a more privileged background have more access and awareness to opportunity. They might have aunties and uncles that have worked in an office, or their parents might have worked in an office. So they already have this office etiquette as their hereditary, within their hereditary source code. So it made me realize that out with it, without out with myself and out with this more privileged group, those from a lower socioeconomic background don't have this hereditary skill set, and they're entering the workplace at a disadvantage because they don't know how to sign off an email or communicate in a hierarchy or any of these soft skills that come with working in an office. So long story short, Zach, fortunately I had that experience prior to joining KPMG that got me ahead, but it was my duty at that point to try and share that to accelerate the paths of others.
Do you think you would have been ready for KPMG if you had gone the year prior?
No, it would have. I would have had a heart attack. I really would have. I would have decombusted. I really don't think I would have, because my previous employment was selling tablet around the house or fudge around the house and being a paper boy. Neither of those experiences equipped me to joining KPMG. I couldn't even tie a tie, Zach. Never mind balance a balance sheet or whatever else I had to do. I think I would have been overwhelmed, and again, I was able to communicate in an office prior to that. I was able to establish office friendships and relationships. I gained that skill. Joining a place like KPMG straight from school, coming from the background that I had, having that same, having those experiences in school where I never felt like I could fit in. Perhaps if I joined KPMG straight from school, I wouldn't have made the networks and connections and friendships that I have now, or been as extroverted as I am now. I believe success isn't about performance; it's about perceived performance. You need to people can only perceive your performance if you put it out there. If you are performative in nature, I don't think I would have started a podcast if I wasn't performative in nature. I wouldn't do public speaking opportunities if I wasn't performative in nature. Um, this all stems back from that inability to disrupt as a kid. But I think that early office environment gave me the grounding to go into a place like KPMG and excel there. So yeah, I don't think I would have been ready. I really don't think I would have.
It
That was such
sounds,
a great question too.
yeah, it sounds like those sorts of moments in your life where it doesn't quite play out how you envisioned it at the time. You know, you might potentially have, in theory, wanted to go to a KPMG, but the fact that you couldn't afford it meant that you took another route. But in a way, you're able to learn what accounting shouldn't be done like. I mean, in terms of the office culture. And I think also when you mentioned about the perhaps unprofessionality of this company, it spoke to me in a way which stresses the importance of understanding interpersonal dynamics and the psychology, the temperament of those that you work with. Because a team ultimately is you have to fit yourself into the puzzle. You can't just operate at work. And obviously, that's something that people who are listening to this are much older will have a full appreciation for and have gone through loads of work dramas. And I can't imagine. But when you were exposed to that, like what do you think were like the biggest lessons that then you took on board that then propelled you into KPMG about yourself and with other people?
It's funny the way I would look at it now. It was like some sort of cold water therapy, right? So cold water therapy is a practice that you do perhaps in the morning, where you indulge, not indulge, it's probably the wrong word, is that you kind of put yourself through a cold shower or a dip in the sea. This exhausting and enthralling sensation because it helps manage your stress, and it also makes all the challenges that you face later on in the day relative to that initial stress. So for me, having such a hardcore, unprofessional, horrible time at my first employer made KPMG feel like a social club almost. It felt like a hobby. And I would witness that unfold around me. The apprentices that joined straight from school, they would complain and find it really difficult. They would look forward to a Friday more than I would. Um, if we were doing training down in London or Birmingham or elsewhere where we were getting put up in hotels, they would complain about having to do that. Whereas because I had this previous experience to relate it to, I felt like I had won the lottery, like I was going to Disneyland or something. Like it was like I was so grateful for the polarization in both my employers. So for me, perhaps that's why I was able to get ahead at work because I was fueled by this gratitude. I really think that's what it was. I perceive these opportunities differently to my peers.
I think listening to that, you can draw parallels with your story of growing up and then having an appreciation for what your parents were able to provide privilege for you, in the same way as this accounting firm gave you perspective of what a good working environment can look like. And I think that's so powerful because a lot of us, we're in bubbles and we aren't able to appreciate the sacrifices and how bad life could be. And it's not a healthy mindset in its entirety, but like you say, and as you demonstrate, it's to an extent, it's definitely very, very healthy. I probably went off on a tangent there, but
No, no, I think it's a huge point. Like people underestimate the power of gratitude. Maybe they underestimate it because it's been totally fetishized in the kind of self-help genre of Instagram these days. But gratitude journaling probably saved my life at one point during the pandemic, where and just prior to the pandemic, a month or two before, my mum passed away, and I was thrown straight into a lockdown. We had all the luxuries, all of our identities taken away from us, all the hobbies that made us us. We couldn't do any longer. All these social activities and interactions and networks that we'd create were taken away from us. It was so easy for me to, and all of us, to fall into this kind of negative mental health spiral, and I did it at times. But gratitude journaling really pulled me out. I would undertake three tasks when I was feeling stressed or unhappy when I was working from home during that period. One of them would be I would go downstairs and talk to my dad, who is a Falklands veteran, Northern Ireland veteran, and I would just ask him to tell me one horror story from one of the wars or army experiences that he would have. So he would tell me things like, "Oh, David, I remember taking the boots off a dead Argentinian," or "David, I remember having to piss on my feet to keep them warm in the Falkland Islands," and then I would think, "Okay, Dad, my life's okay. I'll go back upstairs and work," or I would go a run down the beach because I live coastside, and every time I would run down the beach, I would see either a disabled person or an old person looking at me with this kind of envious smile. They were envious to the fact that I was running. It was almost a look of, I wish I could do that. And that gave me an instant appreciation for my functional health, for being able to run or even walk. And the third thing that I would do would be I would pick up one book, and it's behind me. It's called The Forgotten Highlander. It's a biography of a prisoner of war during World War II, um, who literally had the most catastrophic military career where he at times was a slave on death railway. He was a prisoner of war on a ship that was torpedoed and lived on a raft in the sea for 5 days. He also was captured and taken to Nagasaki, the power plant that was blown up, and faced the aftermath of radioactivity. So, like, I would just pick up that one book and read one line or one sentence or one page of that, and was fueled by caffeine and appreciation and gratitude because I was able to compare my circumstances to these other bubbles, and that really helped. But I must admit, Zach, gratitude can also be disabling. Having a gratitude complex can be disabling. I speak about how I'm so grateful that I have this opportunity at KPMG, and my parents have never had these opportunities in their life. And look where I've came from, and look where I've made it. But that can still be debilitating in a way. It makes me not want to ask for a pay rise or a promotion. You see those from a lower socioeconomic background be so grateful that they've been dragged and dropped into a position like that they're too scared to ask for more. whereas their privileged peers might have a sense of entitlement and have some hereditary skills such as negotiation that they get ahead. And I think that's why pay rises, sorry, not pay rises, pay gaps occur between socioeconomic classes within the workplace at the same grade, is because privileged peers know their worth, they feel entitled, and they are equipped with the skills to negotiate for pay rises. Whereas someone like me is just grateful to get into an institute like that they're too scared to ask for more. And it's going back to that disruption theme where I'm too scared to disrupt at a place like KPMG, or I could be too scared to disrupt at a place like KPMG in case I get caught out and lose my one chance. So I'm grateful for the salary and the opportunity that I currently exist in. So it can be hugely empowering at times, but also you need to be aware that it can be a double-edged sword.
That makes complete sense, and it almost circles back to the question I asked earlier about how disagreeable were you as a child. I suppose you're disagreeable in some senses, but also when you are presented, as you say, with gratitude to those new experiences, and you feel like that sense of imposter syndrome of not deserving it, maybe, or maybe that you deserve it, but that you should just shut up and just be happy and thank you, to everyone that kind of asks. And becoming assertive and standing up for yourself and negotiating on your behalf is a skill, right? It's a skill I've put a lot of time into. I'm still not very good at it. And I see people that are naturals at this, and I see them really put their foot down, but not in an arrogant, aggressive way, but they're just able to negotiate on their behalf firmly and softly. How do you think you've like developed in that particular way? From where you are now, are you 5 years in to
Yeah.
KPMG compared to when you first started?
The difference is night and day. Is night and day. Now that I've had 5 years experience in a place like that, I feel like that's my stripes on my uniform. I have had 5 years of intel and information and understanding to make a calculated decision or opinion or standpoint. Whereas when I was 1 year in or when I first started, I didn't have much life experience to to build a credible standpoint or view. And because I felt like I never belonged, then of course I wasn't going to assert my dominance. Again, like you said, I was too grateful for the opportunity that I would be scared to lose it. But now that I've had 5 years of intel and been able to look at processes, been able to collaborate with people, been able to receive anecdotes from people's personal lives, I've and that goes through the social mobility network, it goes through my podcast. I've spoken to so many people that I'm able to formulate an opinion that I feel is right, and I feel confident. As maybe do you know what it maybe is? It's maybe because coming from the background that I did, I was never academically validated by my parents, so I never knew what was right or wrong. But now that I've been on this pathway for 5 years, where I've been constantly given an instant feedback loop from peers and managers, I can now have an opinion that is calculated based on conversations and intel that I've had over the last 5 years. I'm validated to some degree, whereas I must have felt some sort of invalidity when I first started because my parents would never validate me as a child, and I never had those around me to create a worldview. Because I never had access and awareness to opportunity back then. So I think because I've been on this journey for 5 years, I've been able to curate enough information to have a solid viewpoint, and I've had those around me to validate that. Um, I think that's such a waffly way to put that, but hopefully that makes sense.
So, from what I gather from what you're saying, it's almost that it just takes time to build confidence through a process of positive affirmation and feedback loops to then realize actually I'm really good at what I do and I work hard and that's why I'm really good at what I do. Therefore, I do deserve recognition and we can look at pay, but obviously that's not necessarily the most important dimension, but pay is one of those things and like you say with maybe people from socioeconomic backgrounds with less opportunity, there is that discrepancy, and maybe that explains it because they aren't so sure in themselves. And
That is definitely a more succinct way of saying what I tried to say, Zach. I love that because with opportunity comes a feedback loop. If you've had less opportunity, you've had less access to these feedback loops. So the more you have of these, the more intel that you can get to gauge your self-worth, to gauge your opinions, to gauge your performance, to gauge your worldview and how that stacks up against the world. I think the way that you brought that to life is way first, more succinct than how I tried to waffle around that. So thank you, Zach. And that's such a quality trait in a good host, mate. And I've been enjoying this interview so far.
I'm pleased to hear it. I think it's not possible for me to understand it to the extent that you do, but I'm in summarizing it. It's because I'm trying to make sense of it myself and making sure that I've understood what you've communicated to me correctly. That's almost like I have to repeat it back so that you can either correct me or you go, actually, no, that's you said it well. So I'm glad that on that occasion I wasn't wrong. Some great lessons there, and I kind of want to hone back in on you personally and back into the chronology of where you're at with your journey. I think we roughly got up into the first few years, and then we went off on some great discussions. But if we bring it back to, let's say, 2019 into 2020, you touched on it very briefly about very sadly losing your mum, and then that whirlwind into COVID not long after. Can you take me back potentially to what that was like?
Yeah, and it's something I'm. It's not emotional or touchy and everything for me to talk about. It's something that I talk about with pride. I think grief is something that should be spoken about more often, and I would love to share my journey with that, Zach. So thank you for asking off the bat. I spoke about how I realized at an early age the power that money had or cash flow had within the household. The reason I wanted to be an accountant was because my uncle told me accountants make a lot of money. I realized that my mum's and my dad's mental health conditions were denoted to the lack of money that we had. Financial depression, financial anxiety is exactly what we definitely had in the household. So I chose to be an accountant because it was the first readily available career that I found that could give me money. That whole I'm gonna be an accountant was a that mantra was just and that was just a north star for me to give my mum the things that the neighbours had. To take her out at the weekends, to treat her, to try and bridge that gap between pain and finance. So when she passed away in 2020, just before COVID, it wasn't COVID related, she died of a sudden heart attack. Not only did she pass away, that North Star, that reason for being, that vision of self actualization died as well. So I buried two people on the day of her funeral, or I buried two things on the day of her funeral. I buried maybe two people actually. I buried her and the future version of what I thought David looked like. So I spent a lot of time during my bereavement leave, and that was in 2020, doing practices such as gratitude journaling and meditation and just broader journaling and spending a lot of time in solitude because I had to find out again. It goes back to your first question, not what I am, but who I am, and that's when I came to that north star of wanting to do good for others, and within my gratitude journaling process, I have to write a positive affirmation every single day. And I wrote down, I will be a leader of inspired people and leave a legacy that is unique and concrete. And that became my new North Star. And doing good for others would enable that. So letting go of that old vision of what future David looked like was just as hard as letting go of my mum. So that's why I moved to management consultancy, specifically within the public sector. Because if people don't know what management consultancy is, it's essentially improving productivity or processes within an organization and being pivoted towards the public sector. That meant I was improving services that my family once relied upon and that my peers rely upon, the public sector, the public transport within Scotland or the public health within Scotland, the universal credit or benefit system that my parents relied upon. Being able to be in a world that could improve these services satisfied that North Star of doing good for others. And it was the same time where I doubled down on my conviction to improve social mobility. I was living as a servant to her. She didn't know that. She wasn't aware of that. But the mindset that I had was I am going to collate and create enough resources to give my mum a comfortable life. I was serving one person. I had one fixed identity. So when that was taken away from me, I didn't know who I was. So I had to recreate myself. And we live in a world of abundance where we look online and we see influencers or podcasters or content creators or entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs, and we're bombarded of who we could or should be. So it was a really tough time understanding and spending time configuring who I wanted to be. And having a North Star was the backbone or is the spine that helps me create an identity. So the podcast or my day job or the extracurricular activity I do with the social mobility stuff, these are vehicles that enable this North Star. They're not who I am, but they're what I do. This North Star is who I am. So there's numerous ways I could facilitate that North Star of doing good for others. I've just chosen what vehicles that will get me there.
It's interesting to hear also from the perspective that we live in a world where everything is about, if that thing doesn't serve me in this moment, I'll get rid of it. And I think there's a toxic part of self development which focuses too inward to how we can just maximize our happiness and our lives. But it seems as though, in the way that you describe it, your North Star and your purpose is always focusing on how you can help others. And actually, that comes around because it's fulfilling to do so, especially at the increasing scale that you are doing it, reaching people with your podcast and helping pioneer social mobility in the way that you do. Why do you think that was your North Star to begin with, that as a general kind of idea of external, as opposed to self serving?
It's a great question. Really, really well thought question. The whole monetary aspect of my previous North Star wasn't, it was never for me to have a nice car or me to go lavish holidays or for me to buy material, fashionable goods. It was for someone else. So when it was for my mum, it was to help her. So when she passed away, money was irrelevant to me. I had a salary, I was already securing a job. Increasing my monthly income or my net worth wasn't something that interested me any longer. And I've seen throughout my life, and I can't think of exact examples, but when people do things for themselves, it typically ends badly. But when I've watched people do things for others, it usually has a positive outcome. And by helping people, being of service to people, that you can do both. You can help others, do good for others, and gain from it financially too. Like I can sponsor my podcast, I can reach thousands of lives through my podcast, but I can also sponsor it and get cash for it. They're not mutually exclusive. I just know that I don't know. I'm just so grateful for the opportunities that I have had. I feel like a moral responsibility to pass that on to others. And by doing that, I feel like I get to activate flow state during my podcast. I get to activate flow state when I'm doing public speaking. When I'm doing my day job, I'm constantly in flow state. So that's a signal, at least to me, or an indicator to me that I'm doing the right thing. And perhaps if I was in a completely different career where I was in a sales role selling something that I'm not passionate about, but gaining huge financial reward from it, I don't think I would be in that flow state. I don't think I would be as motivated to excel if I was in a role like that. So the instant feedback that I've had from the podcast, from the day job, and from the social mobility work, whether that's the recognition that I get through being in the Business Insider or recently the Accountancy Age, 35 under 35, or it's just conversations in the DMs of people talking about how my podcast moved them forward. Those instant feedback loops, coupled with the float state that I achieve, is an indicator for me that I'm focused on the right North Star.
And by flow state, just to clarify, you mean when you're kind of dialed in and focused?
Yeah, but flow state is a theory by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who basically says to enter this flow state, you must match a high level of skill with a high level of challenge. And basically, flow state, we've all been in it at some point, whether you're running a race or playing football, where the passage of time is you're unaware of the passage of time. You're just single-handedly focused on one task, and you're unaware of distraction and unaware of the passage of time. I'm sure we can all think of an activity where we've experienced that. And for me, I'm in flow state right now talking to you, Zach.
Sounds like you were able to marry that curiosity and skill that you have and the fulfillment. And when those things all come together is when I think we do our best work and we're able to generate the most meaning. If we look at, because I appreciate that's very much leading us quite nicely into when you set up the podcast, because that was an extension of, or that was your sort of new venture into your new North Star and reaching more people. What sparked the decision to start a podcast, and what was it like setting that up?
The rationale for starting the podcast was that, again, reflecting on my own journey, I never had instant access to role models or heroes. My role models were my tradesman cousins or my dad in the military. I would look on when I had that DNA switch at 16 where I cut my hair and dressed nicely. I started looking online for role models. And at the time, it was the Gary Vaynerchuks of the world and the Grant Cardones of the world and the Anthony or Tony Robbins of the world. And what they said was hugely motivating, but it was very verbose and very articulate and didn't speak to me in a language, an accent that I ultimately recognized. And lucky enough, I was well read enough because of that pivot that I had in my life to digest the concepts, the frameworks, the ideologies, and the theories that they had and reflavor it into my own worldview. But I realized that a lot of people from my part of the world or from my background didn't have that skill set. So I wanted to make self development content as accessible as possible or as relatable as possible. So the premise of the podcast is using origin stories as a self development tool. So anyone that I have on the podcast, much similar to your layout, I'll just have them on and then they'll share their story and they'll share the highlights and the lowlights, and hopefully that gives enough substance and enough lessons for people like me to relate to, but also to use in their arsenal as tools. Starting off, again, it goes back to when you asked me the question about what did your peers think when you were 16 or 17 and shaved your hair and wore a blazer to school. Like podcasting, especially in the west coast of Scotland. I think I must be the only person that I know that has a podcast from this area. I have a couple of mates in the city centre in Glasgow that have one, but from the west coast of Scotland, I know no one else that was doing it at the time. I can imagine I was probably put into group chats and lambasted for it, and people are probably thinking, "Oh my God, David's so cringe." We have this huge cringe culture in the west coast of Scotland where if you're not playing football or supporting Celtic or Rangers, again, you're absolutely lambasted for it. But now that it has legs and that I spoke to Her Majesty the Queen or I've had Netflix documentary stars on or whoever else in between, Scotland's first billionaire, people come up to me on a night out, David, and say, "Oh my God, I listened to your podcast," or "David, let me buy you a drink. Your podcast is doing so great." But if I met them in a bar 50 episodes ago, they wouldn't have said that same thing. It's only now that it's got legs that they yeah, they kind of recognize it. So it was challenging. It's a very you'll know the process yourself, and I'm sure you'll probably reflect and share that on the podcast at some point. You just have to look online and follow the lonely journey of curating enough information to get the appropriate gear, platform, and everything else in between to get it going. It's a very lonely journey. But yeah, it's so funny to see the polarization of behavior between now and then, in terms of the local listeners, especially my local area. I can say I'm the best podcaster in Prestwick because I'm the only one.
Yeah. Oh, you touched on it briefly, but I don't. I think it's worth addressing, especially considering her recent, very sad passing, Her Majesty the Queen. You met her in December 2020 through work on a KPMG call. Wow, that's incredible. I am speaking to someone who spoke with one of the most influential women of the West in the last 100 years. Right? How was that?
Yeah, it was quite the experience. The whole process from front to scratch was quite the experience. So I was told by our kind of communications team that we might be expecting a royal visit to celebrate the firm's 150th year. I was told that there would be a long list of speakers, and if I would mind that I would be added to the long list. I don't know how long this long list was, but even hearing that news that I was on a long list somewhere to speak with the Queen was quite exciting. And then I was told I made the short list, and I was like, oh my gosh, I might actually be speaking with the Queen. So they took this short list and created a bunch of portfolios of stories for the candidates that were on the short list, and they presented that to the the to Buckingham Palace, and they would choose who they wanted the Queen to speak to. And I then found out that yes, young David Mcintosh from the west coast of Scotland was picked to talk about his story and to talk about social mobility with Her Majesty the Queen. And I really vividly remember, and I think I have a photograph of myself from that period. I vividly remember crying outside a walk, whilst outside a walk, for the first time in maybe, yeah, 9 months. It was the longest I had cried about losing my mum, because the only person I wanted to share this news with was no longer here. My own Queen, the only person that would have jumped for joy and been ecstatic for me, wasn't around to hear that news. And that was the first time it made me realize that she was really gone. I wanted to tell her, look, we did it. We did it together, we did it. And I couldn't. But that also forced me to allow her to live on in me when I presented to the Queen. Not only did I speak with the Queen, I feel like she did too. Because all the values, all the traits that she gave me shone through when I spoke to Her Majesty the Queen. She dialed in from Windsor Castle. She asked about my local area. She asked about apprenticeships. She asked about my own social mobility journey. And it was back and forth. What you see online is an edited version. The one that's on the Royal Family YouTube channel or on Sky News or in CNN News. It was famously in the press because our Zoom crashed mid call. But that's an edited version. I had five. I think on the Royal Family YouTube channel it shows that I spoke to her for like 2 or 3 minutes. I had about 5 or 6 with her, and we went back and forth. And she was like a sweet old grandma. She really, really cared. She really did. Um, and when I spoke about my dad being a guard at Buckingham Palace and serving in the army, her face lit up. And when I spoke about the west coast of Scotland, she told me that she had been here. When I look at the emotional reaction in comparison to other speakers, she was really, really embedded in my story, and I could tell it meant a lot to her. And it was at the time I was in that flow state, pumped with adrenaline. I couldn't really recognize how much of a feat that was until afterwards I watched The Crown and realized how much of a huge deal she was. And at that moment, it really cemented that I did something, and it's probably the only time I'll ever do something that only a minute percentile of the world will ever get the opportunity to do. And now that she's passed, I'm very, very grateful to have actualized that, because when I wrote in 2020 when my mum passed away, I wrote, I will be a leader of inspired individuals and leave a legacy that's unique and concrete. I've truly actualized that by meeting the Queen. So it was a very full circle moment for me, Zach.
I'm struggling to ask a follow-up question to that. That's just so profound. I think it's because with the recent passing of Queen Elizabeth, it struck me particularly of like, hang on, like this person is probably the most famous person that any of us will ever have known, not in a celebrity way, but purely for acting out as best she can, given her opportunities and the way she found herself into the situation she was. And not that I'm going to make a comparison between you and the Queen in the same context, but she just spoke to that sense of duty and responsibility and gratitude, and then just doing as much as she could for others, given those factors. And yeah, it's I don't know what to say really. It's incredible that you were able to work to get that opportunity, and I think it is definitely a testimony to your gratitude and perseverance and work ethic. And as you said, you were able to speak to the Queen with very much carrying the almost the spirit of your mum, and it was, you know, a real moment.
Thank you, Zach. That reflection and that kind of golden thread that you tied between the circumstances and environment that she grew up in and the personal responsibility she took to fulfill her public service, and tying that and relating that to me, and where I found myself is one, a huge honor, but I understand the frame of mind or the idea behind that 100%, and I agree with it. But I must admit that opportunity was also deflating, because if I'm not, like we unpicked, I'm not monetary driven. I'm not trying to become Scotland's youngest billionaire or whatever. I'm not. That's not a fleeting desire or a long term desire that I have. My North Star was, or my positive affirmation was to leave that legacy. I felt by meeting the Queen, I had ticked that. I thought if I were to lose my mum and I were to meet the Queen, those two things would happen when I was 40 or 50. They're two events that I would have presumed that would happen later on in my life. The fact that those two pivotal points happened so early on, again lost a huge sense of identity. I didn't know what was next. So that was really difficult as well, Zach. We hear about boxers who prolong their boxing career long after their fitness and talent a goal, because they're chasing this like hedonic treadmill, or this kind of academic validation or validity treadmill. And I've, at that young age of 21, 22, meeting the Queen and losing my mum, like what was to come? Like, how could I beat that dopamine kick? It was hard. It was hard.
But it looks like from the successes you were able to go on to in 2021 and this year that you were able to reflect on those moments and move forth into a really powerful identity of doing good for others. I wondered if you could speak on a little bit more on like the journey out of that, but then just, for example, the moment where you win management consultancy uh, associate award in 2021 and being recognized for your day job, for your day job as well, not anything that you're doing beyond that, right?
Those were huge moments for me, Zach. They really were. But I never pointed and aimed at those. I never thought I'm going to enter the Management Consultancy Association Awards and win Best New Apprentice and be the first Scottish apprentice to win at that. I didn't point and aim at being the youngest person in the Business Insider 35 under 35, or I didn't, and these weren't things that I wanted or aimed for. After that experience with the Queen, I focused on being more present and being better at being a better brother, being a better son, being a better consultant, being a better podcaster, being a better social mobility advocate. I embraced that flow state, embraced those curiosities, and as a byproduct, those rewards came. I never chased them at all. So I think that's important. I think if you have the goal of aiming for an award like that and you don't meet it, you'll be matched with huge dissatisfaction. If you don't enjoy the process, you only enjoy what the process buys you. Whereas I loved podcasting, I loved consultancy, I loved doing good for others, that even if I wasn't recognized for it, I would be internally recognizing it because I enjoyed the process. I was in flow state. No matter the outcome, I would have been grateful for the journey. Whereas if the destination is what causes the happiness, then the whole system is flawed. So I think being more present and enjoying my day to day life, and cashing in or doubling down on my curiosities, I think that's what enabled those external. I think that's what enabled the external validation that I got, whether it was the award wins or the features on lists and things like that. I think that's the catalyst for that, mate.
It's all been building quite a clear picture for me, and I hope it is for anyone watching and listening, of the kind of journey that you've been on and the significant lessons which have impacted the way that you view yourself and the direction that you want to go in from now. I suppose that sort of brings us up to the present day, unless there's anything in particular that you think it's poignant or prudent to talk about.
I think you've done an amazing job of capturing the whole end-to-end process,
Okay.
Zach. Honestly, this has been really such a journey. This podcast, I've unraveled ways of thinking that I haven't before. So I don't think there's anything that's prudent. I think you've been such a comprehensive host so far, mate. I've really appreciated your trust with my story.
Well, that's good to hear. And so, if we look now at where we are now, one of the questions that I get asked in the small way in which I'm trying to do a podcast and work full time and train, and you know what it's like. And I know you're an avid gym goer, and you've been in the game now for a couple of years with the podcasting. How do you do it all? How do you manage to balance it all?
At times, you have to make sacrifices, right? Sometimes one comes at the detriment of the other. For me, having a foundational, solid morning routine that's non-negotiable, is so important for me. If I miss that, which I occasionally do, whether it's after a night out or something like that, the whole day goes to whack. So it's the whole premise of serving yourself before you serve others. I meditate, I journal, I go a walk in sunlight every single morning. I try my best to work out before work as well. Going back to that North Star of doing good for others, if I use my morning, the first part of my day, to serve myself and look after myself, then the rest of my day I can be of service to others. So I think that's hugely important. And I have a spreadsheet that I use that I won't bore you going into the details of, but I basically list out my actionable and non-actionable thoughts on a list, and then drag and drop those actionable items into 30-minute windows within my calendar. There's a really great book called Getting Things Done. And in that book, the author says you only should have a thought once unless a happy thought. Everything else should be externalized. So I have basically a second brain, which is my Excel sheet where I drag and drop all my thoughts into, and then move them into actionable items that look like 30-minute windows. So that's how I kind of prioritize my day. But that's front loaded with a really great routine. One thing that I need to get better at is sleeping with my phone outside my bedroom. I think it's the lowest hanging fruit for better sleep. Better sleep increases better mood, better cognition, more energy. But by moving your phone outside of your room and using a traditional alarm clock, you're not at the mercy of notifications during the night, and you're also not at the mercy of notifications first thing when you wake up in the morning. So I think that's the lowest hanging fruit that you can get, or you can pick to ease the workload during the day because you've been able to get up early and serve yourself. But I'm getting better at that. It's still a work in progress, Zach.
You're absolutely spot on, especially with the charging your phone outside the bedroom. I think that half an hour that you go to bed and half an hour that you wake up, you always see the memes of people staring in pitch black with the light shining and the eyes closed and trying to wince and see the next notification, the next TikTok, or whatever it might be. And we're not designed to live like that, and
No,
it's so
100%.
unhealthy.
Especially when the phone emits so much blue light. I think blue light is the essentially the ray from the sun that kind of regulates your circadian rhythm. Your circadian rhythm is how in tune your body is to sunlight. Evolutionary, we before the world of alarm clocks and iPhone alarms, we would wake up to sunlight, operate during the day. The sunlight would give us all the natural light that would give us energy, and then you would fall asleep when the sun went down, and you would repeat. But if you are replicating that through the light from your phone, your brain doesn't understand whether it's night or day if you're consuming so much blue light before bed. So I think that's hugely important as well. And I have seen those memes. They're really funny.
It does make me laugh, not in a surface level way, but when we have these kind of discussions about what is good for self development and these habits, is it that they're all so easy in theory? They're all the fundamental basics of brushing your teeth, having a shower, being well shaved. That's a weird way to phrase it, but grooming yourself. That's also a weird way to phrase it. You know what I'm saying? Looking after yourself and getting to bed on time and eating well. It's like those things are the building blocks that then you add podcast and social stuff on top of that. And exactly like you say, you're focusing on yourself as a platform from which you're able to then give, because it's like the expression you're pouring from a you can't pour from an empty cup, right? And I think maybe relating to the question of how do you do it all, it's clear that okay, whilst you might not have perfected it, none of us have perfected it. You focus on the simple things of getting sunlight and getting to the gym and setting yourself up. And I think that if there's one lesson from the successes that you had is if there's one lesson from the successes that you've had, it's that not to neglect the really mundane systems and habits which allow those things to happen.
100%. They all provide, by having such a robust routine in the morning as well, waking up at the same time and following the same set of tasks, you minimize decision fatigue. You don't have to think of what you do first thing in the morning because you just get up and do it. So that reserves mental RAM if you were to think about your brain like a processor. It reserves mental RAM for you to make the decisions that matter, not the decisions like what time will I wake up, or will I eat before I walk, or will I jump in a shower this morning? Like you're saving the amount of decision you're banking decisions that you can use for the most important ones. It's the same reason why Mark Zuckerberg wears the same outfit every single day, or Obama did in office. And I think meditation's such a low hanging fruit. If you think have minimizing decision fatigue enables clarity. I think if you're balancing so many projects like you and I do, Zach, you need to be able to think well. Um, Sleeping well enables that, but also having clarity of thought enables that. And you can gain that by meditating. I feel like your thoughts are like apples on a tree. If you don't meditate, these apples fall if and when they please. Some apples are good, some apples are rotten, some ideas are good, some ideas are awful, some thoughts are great, some are toxic. But meditation for me, that practice of mindfulness and being present is like having a ladder against the tree. You can go up and pick what thoughts are good and what thoughts are bad, what apples are good and what apples are bad, and you can pick them free will. So for me, meditating allows me to abstractly think about it creates a mindfulness gap between something happening and my response to it. And that enables so much clarity for me. It allows me to make better decisions. It allows me to prioritize tasks. I think meditation, whether you use Calm or Headspace or Oak or Insight Timer, these are four great apps. I think that's such a cheap, low hanging fruit to to use as well. I'm not sure if you practice meditation, Zach, but it's been a huge game changer for me.
I think definitely spending some time to be still, if that's what meditation is as a broader thing, is certainly certainly well recommended. I just wanted to kind of pick up on this. It's such an accountant thing that you've got a spreadsheet to track all of your thoughts and ideas, but it's almost like, I had a thought when you were mentioning it there. You speak about the bad and the good apples falling from the tree, but it's almost like for you, you have the Excel spreadsheet as a way to catch the good apples before they disappear out and you forget about them, right? And I think that's an equally important thing is when you have a great idea spontaneously, which will be when you're in the still moment, going for a walk, not listening to anything in particular, you can think of it. And the fact that you have a place to bank that is invaluable because you come back to it and go, I can't believe I thought of that great idea. Let me try and do it.
And so in this master spreadsheet, I did tell you I wasn't going to bore you about it, but I'm going to bore you now. Every single day, I write down 10 creative ideas, whether that's having Miley Cyrus's face printed on the back of a t-shirt, whether it's um, an app that delivers dog food, just random ideas. I force myself to have 10 of them every single day and I capture them. I never pursue any of them, mate. I never pursue any of them. But it's just stimulating that way of thinking outside of the box. Because, like you said, I'm an accountant. I work under frameworks, I work under regulation. Being able to think illogically and psychologically and think about weird, random, creative, abstract ideas every single day. Yeah, it builds that muscle, and being able to, like you said, capture my thoughts every single day and noting them somewhere. I now have an audit trail for the last 2 years of every idea I've ever had, every thought I've ever had. How valuable is that? I really implore people to just do a little bit of journaling every single night, or just having a place where they store their thoughts and feelings. And the superpower of a podcast, Zach, and I really, this is my number one benefit of starting a podcast is that now you will have an audit trail of every meaningful conversation or the most meaningful conversations that you've had. I've got an audit trail of the most meaningful conversations I've had over the last 2 years. And each time I show up on a podcast as a guest or as a host, I'm presenting a different version of David in a different version in a different time. So I can go back and see what I was going through or how I was thinking, whether it was right, whether it was wrong. But I can go back and examine that version of David. And doing that same practice with an Excel spreadsheet is something very similar to that.
You're essentially describing how useful it is to learn in public because you're able to share your development by David along the way. And as you say, the audit trail, and other people are then able to come on that journey with you and learn also from themselves. So it's providing yourself with value, but through giving value to others. And I think people are embarrassed to learn in public, right? Because to learn, you have to be a fool at the beginning. Like I'm sure you would have been at the start of the podcast, and like I still am, early days. But absolutely, I think that's some spot on advice when it comes to.
Well, mate, you're doing a better job than me. I don't think you're failing at all. That's for sure. You're not fail. You're not a fail at this game, mate. You're fantastic. You're such a great host. I think there is. I feel like our generation, enabled by social media, have a reluctance to fail in public because online all we see is people's highlights, the perfectionists, the celebrities, the influencers who look like they get it right every single time. But that doesn't reflect reality. But because that is the catalogue that we have to look through life, we are discouraged to start a new creative endeavor because we believe that we might be lambasted for it online because like we spoke about those how opportunities create feedback loops. We're negating ourselves of those opportunities if we are resistant to failure. Yeah, I really believe social media has amplified the inability or the lack of appetite to fail because everything that we do seems like it's on a pedestal. If not, if we do something in the street, whether we're trying to learn skateboarding, everybody has a CCTV surveillance system in their pocket. They have a mobile phone. If I'm pogo sticking down the street because I want to be the Britain's best pogo sticker, someone's going to film that somewhere. So I feel like the increase in social media, but also camera technology, I think that has discouraged people's appetite to fail.
Well, I think hopefully you can be an example, and as I develop myself, I can be an example to people that it's okay to fail in public. I know for sure over the last 3 years, the number of embarrassing things I've shared publicly on my story that I look back on and cringe now. I'm sure you have the same, but
Mate, I'm going to cringe about that. I just used the example of a pogo stick. Like, I'm going to cringe in 2 weeks' time that I used that as an example.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's certainly not what I'm going to start doing, pogo sticking around, but I don't have the balance for that. Um, I am conscious of time, but I know there's a couple of things I wanted to ask. Looking presently and forward, I'm going to go down a completely other path we haven't touched on. But I was reading some of the captions of some of your Instagram posts. One of them was a picture of you stood next to the Shard, and it said, "Two of the biggest pricks in London." You were also located in the Czech Republic, saying, "Check yourself before you wreck yourself." And I've recently seen you attending stand-up comedy lessons. David, what is it that you're looking to do? You seem like a funny chap. Is that something you're looking to pursue?
Oh, I'm so embarrassed. I'm not embarrassed. I'm glad that you asked this question. We kind of spoke about happiness not being a destination but a process earlier. For me, I think happiness is a fleeting symptom. It's not something that's ever long or ever present. For me, I try and follow the concept of regret minimization. I don't want to be 60, 70, 80, or 90 and have any regrets about my 20s and 30s. I want to explore every flirting curiosity that I have. And one of those is comedy, stand up comedy. It's my vice. It's what I go to on a weekly basis or a monthly basis as an outlet. I think the ability comedians have to make one room cohesively feel a certain emotion. I think that's a true superpower. I think that's direct. That's so intersectional with work, with podcasting. That one skill will allow me to progress in all these other realms. So I thought using this framework of regret minimization, I would regret if I never tried it. So I'm now going to 8 weeks of stand-up comedy lessons and have a gig booked on the 27th of I don't want to say this publicly in case people attend, but I know they won't. The 27th of November in Glasgow at the biggest comedy venue. I did skydiving 6 months ago before that. I play guitar, picked up a guitar. I just like doing miniature projects, whether it's podcasting or stand-up comedy. Um, I'll probably be on to knitting next, mate, if we do an episode two, or pottery.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, comedy's the one for now, and I'm really excited. Yeah, to embark on this journey.
I admire you completely for throwing yourself in because I can't imagine anything more nerve wracking than the potential rejection. Because we often talk about expectation within business and within in relationship, right? And the audience is going to a stand up full of expectation that this person is here to say something funny.
Unlike watching something at home, I think the audience at a comedy club rely on preferential attachment. It's a process. That's the kind of concept of if one person does something, the another person will follow suit. So hopefully, if I can make one person laugh in a room, other people will too. But I understand those fears, and I have those fears too. But if it's a fear, then it's something that it's a fear that I should try and conquer. I believe. And even if I do fail and no one laughs, it's again another opportunity. It's been another opportunity. It's been another feedback loop. I've learned that I'm not funny, or I can't write good jokes, or I'm not good at delivery. So it's a win-win, Zach. I'm really looking forward to it. And if there's any clips, I'll make sure to share them with you, whether they're people dying in hysterics or people dying with cringe at my poor landed jokes.
I look forward to it. What does the future hold? Not just with work, but podcasting, and obviously not just the stand up, but where do you want to take the direction of your life in the next 5 years? If you could have it as you want.
Long-term planning is overrated because if I have a again talking about when we're speaking about these awards and the recognition, if I were to say to you, Zach, I would love to have the number one podcast in the UK, or I would love to be featured on in Forbes or something like that. My sacrifice is that I become that if I do, and it means that I've said no to spontaneous items that might have came up during the way that could have led to a more fruitful outcome. So for me, I can't answer that because I think long-term planning is overrated. Like I've done for my entire life, whether it's the skydiving, the comedy, the podcasting, I'm just fulfilling miniature projects when they arise. So I can't give you a definite answer for that, Zach. I'll be just doing my best to turn my own curiosities into opportunities and doing that in a cyclic manner until I'm no longer fit to do so, I believe. And if I get recognition along the way or some sort of higher status or some sort of net worth, then that's just a positive byproduct, I believe. But as long as I have that guiding principle of doing good for others, like stand-up comedy is doing good for others, bringing people into a room and allowing them to escape whatever they've left at the doors and allowing them some laughter. If I can excel in comedy and facilitate that, then that's great. But yeah, I would say that's my waffly answer to that. I'm very sorry that I can't give you an exact title or accolade for that one, Zach.
I think I prefer that answer to someone who pretends to know that they'll want to do something in 10 years. I think if there's any lesson that I've learned and learned from other people, is that 5 years ago, most people didn't see themselves where they are today or
No,
even want to be.
100%. Again, to reiterate, it's about enjoying the process, not what the process buys you.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate this conversation. And for the listeners, I'm sure they're dying to hear more about your story and not just your story, but the stories that you're able to bring to light on your podcast and your endeavors. How can people get in touch and find you?
First of all, thank you, Zach, for this privilege. You have been a mind blowing host. you have you seem to have garnered the skills in your arsenal that most hosts take hundreds of hours to achieve in just a few episodes. You should be hugely proud of that, and I'm sure your listeners really appreciate that already. I appreciate that you've invited me on and trusted me on your platform, which is going to go on to huge things. If your listeners would like to tune into my podcast, they can find me online at the Development by David podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. If you want to reach out to my personal account, it is David McIntosh, JR for Junior, on Instagram, David McIntosh on LinkedIn, and my podcast account on Instagram is Development by David. I'd love for people to get in touch and say hello. I'm always
I
looking
would
to make
as
new
well.
friends.
I think your podcast is fantastic. As I've mentioned, it's one of the reasons that I started mine, and there's some fantastic episodes on there. I suppose again, I don't want to ask you to recommend a particular episode, but if people want to head over and just follow your podcast, hit the notification bell, then they'll know when the newest ones get released. But yeah, as again, I want to reiterate my thanks for your time this evening. And if you can hear that noise, I don't know where it's coming from, but my alarms decide to go off and immediately stop as soon as I mention it. So sorry if you could hear that during the process, but I suppose it's a natural. It's telling us something to bring it to a close. But thanks everyone for listening. My name has been Zach Van Snell. Been joined by Development by David, and I'll see you next time. Nice.
That was a lot of fun. That was a lot of fun, mate.